And so last week, we raised this very important question. Who is Jesus to you? And we also saw how you answer this question radically affects your life. By this time in our text, Jesus has already predicted his death 3 times. We saw that first in chapter 8, and then in chapter 9, and then here again in chapter 10. In the previous verses, especially in verse 32 to 34, Jesus predicted his death again. But it's clear from our text today that the disciples did not understand why Jesus came. So from verses 35 to 45, we're going to follow 3 insights. Number 1, the thirst for power. Number 2, the cup of suffering. Number 3, the king who gave up his power. The thirst for power, the cup of suffering, the king who gave up his power. Number 1, the thirst for power. Verse 35. And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said to him, Teacher, Sensei, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. Verse 36. And he said to them, What do you want me to do for you? In verse 37, they said to him, Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory. Now, James and John here said to Jesus, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. How does Jesus respond? Jesus does not say, how about a little respect? How about some humility? How dare you talk to me like that? No, he's not annoyed. He's not irritated. He graciously says in verse 36, What do you want me to do for you? That was Jesus. He is gracious. He says, What do you want me to do for you? And they said in verse 37, Grant us to sit when you come in your power, one at your right hand and one on your left in your glory. And keep that word in mind, in your glory. See, they wanted glory for themselves. They wanted a throne for themselves. They may have heard what Jesus said in Matthew 19:28. There Jesus had said that those who follow him would sit on the 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel in his future kingdom. Jesus there was talking about the future kingdom that is going to come, where there will be people sitting on the 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. But we've seen this selfish ambition before in chapter 9, verse 34, right? There the disciples argued about who was the greatest among them. Even here in verse 31, Jesus had said that the first would be the last. But it's clear that James and John still want to have the first and the second place in Jesus' kingdom. They're saying to Jesus, say, when you come in your power and occupy your throne, give us a prominent seat in your cabinet, in your kingdom. See, they want the highest ranking place in Jesus' kingdom. And keep in mind, James and John were Jesus' first cousins. Perhaps they were thinking that their family connections would really help them gain favor with Jesus. How many of you remember the Tower of Babel project in Genesis 11? In Genesis 11, see, the Tower of Babel was built by people to make much of their own names, right? They built a tower to make a name for themselves. And so we see that same kind of love for power right here in James and John. See, in the society that we live, people climb up the corporate ladder to make a name for themselves, even at the cost of neglecting their families and friends. And by the way, that's why it's not uncommon for us to hear of corporate executives and senior professionals struggling with psychopathic behaviors, right? When companies hire people, for instance, they tend to hire people or they tend to emphasize skill or competency rather than on character. Of course, you don't have the time to vet all of the character properly, right? You're in need of workers in your company, and you're quick to hire people without vetting them carefully or having no due process to vet their character. And so senior professionals, when they are hired, they can sometimes have a very toxic effect on their co-workers, right? How many of you know the 19th century British politician, Lord Acton, said this quote, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely." See, in a survival of the fittest society, you step on people's toes to push yourself up. That's the survival of the fittest. The strong eat the weak. The strong use their power to dominate and bully the weak. That's how people use power. See, please hear me out. Wanting influence is not a bad thing. Wanting power in and of itself is not a bad thing, right? But as Rebecca Pippert says, she says this, whatever controls us is our God. The person who seeks power is controlled by power. Whatever controls us is our God. The person who seeks power is controlled by power. In other words, what she's saying is deep down there is this desire to climb up the social ladder. Why? To be admired, to be in power, to look great on the outside, for a competition for reputation and success. Although success is not bad in and of itself. But Rebecca Pippert says that, see, the person who idolizes power is controlled by power on the inside. That's what drives you, a desire to gain power and dominance over others, to domineer others, to control others. And this produces fear, right? If power is your idol, it produces fear of humiliation in the heart. If success is your idol, it produces fear of humiliation, fear of shame. And so you do everything to cover up that shame because there's fear driving your heart. Fear of not succeeding, fear of not winning. Deep down, there is a desire to get into the inner circle of who is who. That is a great competition in this city. Yet, see, James and John here are already part of the inner circles of Jesus' disciples. Yet they were not satisfied. They have seen Jesus in glory, but they weren't satisfied. Right? They have seen Jesus transfigured on the Mount of Transfiguration in chapter 9. They have seen Jesus for his greatness. Yet they are not satisfied. See, if you feel small on the inside, you want to look great on the outside. See, there is a longing in the heart that says, if only I get into this position, into some place of power and influence, into some place of significance, then my life will have meaning and significance, and I'll be happy. But see, if you serve the false god of power, your heart is never at rest. Right? Because Rebecca Pippert says the person who seeks power is controlled by power. And so you never find rest in your heart. How many of you know Robert Greene Ingersoll, the agnostic? He's an agnostic, and he said this, quite profound. Most people can bear adversity, but if you wish to know what a man really is, give him power. This is the supreme test. End of quote. He says, most people can bear adversity, but if you wish to know what a man really is, give him power. This is the supreme test. In other words, what you do with the power that is given to you really, really shows you. The little power that has been given to you really shows you the kind of person that you are. It brings out your character, it says. Power struggle is very real in the heart, even at the very bottom of the leadership ladder. Right here we see James and John. They're not asking for the honor of dying with Jesus, right? What they really want is a kingdom for themselves, where they can exercise authority over others, where they can control others and dominate over others. They were hoping to replace the oppressive power structure of the Romans with their own self-serving power structure. They wanted the seat of honor. They wanted the seat of power. In other words, see, they haven't really understood why Jesus had come. So what does Jesus say? Next, Jesus shows them the cup of suffering. Take a look at this, verse 38. Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized?" Verse 39. And they said to him, "We are able." And Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink. And with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." Verse 41, "And when the 10 heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John." Now, the cup that Jesus is talking about is a symbol of God's judgment against sin. Baptism, again, being under the water, is an Old Testament picture of being overwhelmed by calamity. You see this all over the Old Testament, that when you're underwater, you feel overwhelmed by calamity. But here, Jesus is going to be overwhelmed by bearing God's judgment for sin on the cross. Right? In other words, see, Jesus is thinking of his humiliation, and they are dreaming of a throne. He says, "You do not know what you are asking." And he's talking about being disgraced for their sake, and they are thinking of their own honor, right? This is amazing. And notice when Jesus asked in verse 38, "Are you able to drink the cup that I drink?" They said, "We are able." They're quite confident of themselves, right? They're overconfident because why? They're still thinking, if we can fight and help Jesus overthrow the Romans, maybe he'll grant us that place of power, that seat of power. Because keep in mind, in the Jewish minds, right, in the minds of James and John, like Peter, they're thinking that the Messiah is going to come and gain a political power, overthrow the Romans, and so they can get a chance to sit on his throne with Jesus, one on the left, one on the right. But what does Jesus mean in verse 39 when he said, "The cup that I drink, you will drink, and you will be baptized"? See, James and John did drink the cup of suffering, and they were baptized with the baptism of suffering. James, by the way, was the first of the disciples to die for Jesus. He was martyred for Jesus. Acts chapter 12, verse 1 to 2 tells us that he was beheaded by King Agrippa. Right? But John would live to be about 95 years old and suffer persecution for Jesus. We see that in Revelations 1:9. See, they asked for a place of power and recognition, and Jesus gave them the honor of suffering for his sake. Wow. And so Jesus says, "To sit at my right hand or my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those whom it has been prepared." And notice verse 41. When the 10 disciples, right, heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John. The word indignant there means they're annoyed, they're angry at James and John. There was unhealthy competition among the disciples in their strive for greatness. But why were the disciples so upset at James and John? Have you ever wondered? Because they also want power like James and John. You see this kind of competition even among kids, right? One kid says to his mom, "Mom, I want to dress up like Iron Man." And all the kids that time say, "No, I want to be Iron Man too. I want to be Iron Man. I want to be Iron Man, not Batman." Why? Because Iron Man has more superpowers than Batman. And so there is this competition, strive for greatness, strive to be the Iron Man, the right-hand man, the man with power, right? You see this among kids. So my question to you is, have you ever been upset or annoyed at someone who thinks that they should be number one? Right? Have you ever been upset or annoyed at someone who thinks that they should be number one? C.S. Lewis says that pride is competitive. How many of you know Lewis, the Chronicles of Narnia writer, right? He said this: "Each person's pride is in competition with everyone else's pride. It is because I wanted to be the big nose at the party that I'm so annoyed at someone else being the big nose. It is the comparison that makes you proud, the pleasure of being above the rest. Once the element of competition has gone, pride has gone." Wow. Pride is by nature competitive in the hearts of kids and in the heart of James and John and the disciples. Do you see how exhausting it is to live this way? To be in perpetual competition with others. It is exhausting. It will drain you out. It will drive you to bitterness. It will drive you to fear of humiliation. It will bring out your greatest nightmares and fears because you're perpetually in this city competitive, unhealthy competition, strive for greatness that is driving this restless and anxious city. It is tiresome. See, the reason I feel bothered is because my pride is competitive. And the only way to be free is to remove my pride, right? So how can we be free from this prideful comparison and competition? How can we be free from this restlessness, this restless competition that drives at the very heart of our being, that drives us every day? When we look at people who are more beautiful than us, right? Why are we comparing? C.S. Lewis says, it is this comparison, right, that makes you proud. The pleasure of being above the rest. And if you have the pleasure of being above the rest, you're sad that you're not above that person because you're comparing yourself with that person. Do you see the insecurity that drives us? Do you see how our lives cannot be built on this kind of idols, right? Such as the idol of power, the idol of wanting to be above the rest. So how can we be free? By looking to the humble king who gave up his power. Look at the king who gave up his power right here. Verse 42, and Jesus called them to him and said to them, you know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. See, Jesus, right here, has come, right? Not to grab power. We're going to see this in a minute. Look at verse 42. The Roman society was run by an emperor who controlled politics and the army. Okay? So the disciples have seen only the Roman ways of power, authority, position, and ambition. Right? But Jesus says in verse 43, it shall not be so among you. He says, don't look at the system of power, the power structure around you, the ambition, the authority, the hunger for power, fame, reputation, and success, and imitate that as a way to gain power and become significant in the eyes of the world, because that is a system that cannot bring you the satisfaction and the longing that your heart is desperately searching for. Jesus is saying, when you build your life around that, it will crumble. Right? Because the disciples have seen how the Romans have ascended to power, how the Romans have authority over the Jews, how the Romans have oppressed this society. They have seen how the Romans gain favor in the eyes of the others, and whoever sided with the Romans in the Jewish society gained a good standing, including the tax collectors, because they worked for the Romans. And so they have seen that kind of power structure. But Jesus says, look, it shall not be among you, because you are my disciples. He says, whoever aspires to be great among you must be your servant. In other words, when Jesus came, he turned the power structure upside down. He came, he revolutionized the systems of his time upside down. He turned the power structure of that time on its head. This is amazing. Jesus' way is servanthood. He says, whoever aspires to be great among you. If you want to be great, he says, if your heart is really searching for greatness, become a servant. Wow. And verse 44, if you aspire to be the first among you, you must be slaves of all. Because why? James and John and the disciples were still striving for the first place. They even had the audacity to come and ask Jesus that he would grant them a place on his throne. One on the right, one on the left. And Jesus says, if you really want to be the first among you, you must be slave of all. Now, modern people tend to think that being treated as a servant or slave is injustice. But as one pastor famously says, if you really want to know, if you really want to test your desire to serve people, check your heart when people treat you like a servant. Wow. If you really want to know whether your desire to serve is genuine, check your heart when people treat you like a servant. Modern people tend to think, oh well, being treated as a servant and as a slave, who would do that? That's injustice. But keep in mind that in that society, a servant and a slave were two of the lowest positions in society. And Jesus was saying, using that as a metaphor and saying, if you want to be great, look at that. Look at the servants. Look at the slaves. Become a slave of all. Become a servant. Voluntarily. That's even harder. If someone oppresses you, if you were under the Roman Empire and they oppressed you, you had no choice to be a slave. You had no choice to be a servant because they really treated you like a servant. They had power and military authority over you. You really don't have a choice. But voluntarily become a servant, voluntarily become a slave, now you're really starting to get the heart of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. See, he says, if you want to be great, serve others voluntarily. If you want to be great, serve others in humility. Like the disciples here, many people want to be in a place of authority. But the way up with Jesus is servanthood. The way up with Jesus is servanthood. The way to authority with Jesus is servanthood. Right? Jesus is saying, if you really want to be in authority, before you can be in authority, serve under authority. Be under authority. Serve. Become a servant. Give up your power and serve. In other words, true greatness, Jesus is saying, is selfless, sacrificial service to others. But see, how many of you know servanthood is very hard? Servanthood is very hard if you want to be treated as a king. If you want to be treated as a boss, servanthood is very hard. So where can we get the power to serve? Where can we receive that kind of power to serve others? Look at verse 45. Jesus says, for even the Son of Man, that is Jesus, came not to be served, but to serve. He says, I came not to be served, although I have every right to demand service as the King of Kings. In many world religions, see, the leader comes to live as a great example. In Christianity, however, Jesus came not to be a mere example. He came to die and give his life as a sacrifice. Wow. Jesus says, I came to give my life as a ransom for many. The word ransom means a payment to release slaves from bondage. Many of you are familiar with the ransom that kidnappers and hijackers demand, right? Ransom means buying back people from slavery or prison or death by paying a heavy price, right? See, we were enslaved to sin, serving false gods of our own making, such as the idols of power, the idols of comfort, the idols of reputation and fame and success, right? But Jesus paid a heavy price for our release. He says, I came to give my life as a ransom for many. I came to buy you back at the cost of my own life. Not with money, not with gold, but I came to buy you back with my life. I came to give my life as a ransom for you. It means Jesus gave his life in our place. Look at that. He says, I came to give my life as a ransom for many. The word for, anti, in the Greek means instead of, in the place of. In other words, see, Jesus gave his life as our substitute, in our place, in our stead. This is amazing. Right? Jesus gave his life as our substitute. He didn't come to be just a good moral example. He came to our rescue. Right? He came to pay the debt we owe to God so that we might be released from sin slavery. Sin is enslaving us, but Jesus is the great master who came to deliver us by paying a ransom for us. He paid it by his own life. His blood was shed. This is a costly, costly ransom that Jesus paid for us. See, Jesus became the most influential man in history, not by grabbing power, but by giving up power. Jesus became the most influential man in history, not by grabbing power, but by giving up power. It was so different from the systems that the disciples had understood at that time, right? He came to give us the power to live by becoming weak on the cross. Jesus, the King of Kings, became the last, the least, and the lowest on the cross in order that we who did not deserve to be honored might have a place in his kingdom. On the cross, Jesus, who knew no sin, drank the cup of God's wrath, so that we who deserve God's judgment might drink the cup of God's blessing. That's what he said in the Garden of Gethsemane. Father, let this cup pass from me. He says, cup. What cup is that? The psalmist says, I will lift up the cup of my salvation. Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, as he was sweating blood, was saying, if it is possible, let me not face this judgment that is coming upon me. This is overwhelming. This is like a calamity coming upon me. I cannot conceive to bear this. Even as your only son, as the Son of God, it is too weighty for me. Let this cup pass from me. Yet not I, but yours, not my will, but yours be done. And he drank the cup of suffering. He drank the cup of God's wrath so that you and I can drink the cup of God's blessing, so that we can dine with Jesus when he comes back in his kingdom. We don't have time to look into this. When Jesus comes back, there will be a great wedding feast where we will dine, we will drink with him again. But in the meantime, we can receive the cup of blessing, the forgiveness that God pours out on us. God pours out his wrath on his Son, the cup of suffering, the cup of wrath, the cup of judgment in our place. Jesus took that so that you and I can receive the cup that God is pouring out on us, the cup of forgiveness, the cup of being the child of the Most High King, the cup of this new identity, the cup of our eternal inheritances, the cup of blessing, the cup of forgiveness, reconciliation with God, all the spiritual blessings that he has purchased for us in Jesus Christ. That's the blessing that God is pouring out on us because he poured out the cup of wrath on his Son. Jesus is the greatest of the kings who came to be the servant of all, right? See, Jesus, as I said, did not come to grab power. He came not to gain military victory, but to defeat sin, evil, and death. Jesus is the humblest king who came to take up a cross instead of a throne. All the world powers try to take up a throne, including James and John and the disciples. But Jesus is the humblest servant king who came to take up a cross. He came to take up a towel. He came to wear an apron, not a crown of gold, but a crown of thorns. This is the servant king. See, rather, Jesus used his power to serve, even though he had every right to demand service. As the King of Kings, he had every right to demand service, and he forfeited that right and emptied himself as a servant. There is no way, there is no other leader like this. There is no king in the history of the world like this king. He is the King of Kings, yet he became the servant of all. He used his power to lift up others, to heal others, not to lord it over them. He wears an apron and a crown of thorns, right? Jesus came to give away his power on the cross so that we who are weak, who are powerless, will have the power to live. So that we who are powerless over sin will have the freedom to walk with Jesus, to walk with God. He delivered us from sin slavery, that we will no longer serve sin. Sin will no longer be our master, but Jesus will be our master. That's the kind of freedom that Jesus has brought us. So that when we try to serve people and the self-centeredness that stands in the way, what Jesus has done is that he has taken away that sin that weighs heavy on our hearts, that self-centeredness that blocks people away, that is self-protective, self-preserving. Jesus comes in and ravishes our heart, and he shows us not only an example, but by his substitution, what it means to pour yourself out. All true love is substitutionary. It is costly. And Jesus paid that kind of debt on the cross. His love is costly. And see, this is why we can now walk in freedom to serve others. He came to give away his power so that in our weakness we will have the power to serve others. As we trust in his power, the idols of power, the idols of our hearts begin to lose their grip on us. Look at Jesus' sacrificial love for you today. I want to encourage you. Look at how much he has poured himself out on the cross for you in sacrificial love, and serve from that place of being ravished by Jesus' love. Look at the royal status he earned for you. If you struggle to serve others selflessly, Actually, in verse 15, I'll close with this. In verse 15, it says this, that Jesus was saying, "Truly I say to you, whoever shall not receive the kingdom of God like a child shall not enter it." See, Jesus, the greatest of the kings, was cast outside of the kingdom and was treated as a slave so that you can enter his kingdom and become the child of the Most High King. That is the identity he earned for you. In other words, if you want power to serve others selflessly, receive this new identity that Jesus has purchased for you. You're a child of the Most High King. You don't gain your sense of worth, dignity, and value from the system of the world by trying to prove yourself to the world. Jesus already earned it for you. You're free. You're a child of the Most High King. All the treasures of the Father, all the inheritance has been purchased for you. Jesus bought that, and therefore you serve out of the riches that God has given you, the royal status that Jesus has earned for you. You want true greatness? This is true greatness. You're a child of the Most High King. And so serve from that place of identity. Serve from that place of royal status that Jesus earned for you. So this week, let's look out for those who we can serve. Let's look out also for the interests of others. Philippians 2 says, Jesus emptied himself, right? And then he says, let's look not only to our own interests, but also for the interests of others. Let's serve one another and others in our workplaces. Look out for those who need help. Look for ways to serve your neighbors from a place of rest in your identity as a child of God. Look out for ways you can give a cup of water to those who are thirsty, or a cup of coffee to your coworkers. Lend a listening ear. People are broken. They're in need of healing. Lend a listening ear to someone. Look out for those who you can empathize and pray for them. Look out for ways to encourage the faint-hearted, to show random deeds of kindness. Don't wait for people to tell you. Charles Spurgeon says, people who have been born again by grace do not need to be told to serve. They serve because of the grace that has been given to them. It's natural to serve. It's natural if you really have the riches of the gospel in you. You won't feel like serving others with drudgery. That is dutiful religion. This is not dutiful religion. Jesus has come to liberate us from sin slavery, from our own self-righteousness, from our sin's destruction, from the idols of our hearts. So serving should not be burdensome, especially when you know that you are a child of the King. The reason we cannot give others, let me speak to you heart to heart. The reason we cannot give others from our hearts is because when we enter into relationships, our hearts are needy. We're trying to live off of the other person, to give me love, to give me approval, to give me affirmation, to give me. Only Jesus can give you that. If you live that way, to gain all of the approval, the affirmation, the love, the longings of your heart, and trying to live up from the other person, the person is a human being, he's not God. He cannot give you. You cannot idolize human relationships like that. It will lead to despair in the end, because the other person will be exhausted, they'll feel depleted, and they'll feel like they can't give you anymore. But guess what? It doesn't have to be that way. Jesus earned it for you, and Jesus will always give you what your heart needs. He has given you this royal status, right? As a child of the Most High King. So believe that, receive that, and rest in that, and serve from that place of riches, the affirmation, the love, all of the things that Jesus has purchased for you. Receive it from Him and help those who are in need. Instead of living it off of the other person, you start to give. In other words, you don't come to Jesus, you don't come to into relationships like James and Joy and say, what can I get out of this relationship? You now come into relationship to give because Jesus has given much for you. Because Jesus has given much to you, you have much to give to others. You serve from a place of joy and rest. The identity that you no longer need to earn, the approval that you no longer need to earn, the power that you don't need in order to control anyone else. You serve from a place of freedom. The world system cannot give you this. You serve from a place of unconditional love, substitutionary love that Jesus poured out of you, for you. It is from this place of vertical relationship with Jesus that you have all the resources that you need. This horizontal relationship cannot give you that. But you receive perpetually from this because God's cup is being poured out to you. Is being poured out richly to you in Christ. And it doesn't run empty because He has endless resources, endless love, endless mercy. His mercies are new every day. There is so much more in Jesus Christ. We of all people to be the most resourceful people in this world. And so don't feel sorry for yourself. Look at Jesus. Look at how much this great King of Kings poured Himself out so richly for you, that He drank the cup of God's suffering on your judgment on your behalf, so that the cup of God's blessing might be poured out. That grace is constantly being poured out to you. He's not a stingy God. He's so lavishly affirming you and loving you. He will love you for all of eternity. This is what Jesus purchased for you. So it is from that place of receiving from God that you give to others. This is good. This is good. I'm telling you, this is what I preach to myself. So every Sunday when I'm going to preach to you, I preach this to myself. The more I receive it from God, the more I have to give to you. Do you see this? If I don't have anything, I got nothing to give to you, but I keep receiving it from Jesus. He already earned it for me. I don't have to work so hard for it. I have to just trust in His power and let Him flow, right, through you. So lift up those who are weak, lift up those who are weary, help those who are in desperate need of someone to listen to, so that others may know more of the servant king who came to serve and give his life as a ransom for us. Would you stand as we close?